and thank you to everyone for joining us for what I'm sure is going to be a really excellent session. For those of you that don't know me, and I see quite a few of you that I haven't met yet, I am Rachel Robinson. I am the Vice President at MassMedic. If you don't know about MassMedic, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this session. We are thrilled to be partnering with BMT Advisors on this, and we know it's going to be something that you really enjoy. MassMedic is the Medical Device Trade Association for New England. So our whole goal is to make life better for medical device companies and those who are looking to do business with medical device companies in New England. We have over 300 member companies who we advocate on behalf of and work to improve their status. So it's a little bit about what we do. If you have any questions, you can go to massmedic.com. We'd love to learn more about what you do. We do host programs like this very regularly. Often our programs are in person due to the current situations. We've gone completely virtual. So I think in the past 4 months, we've done about 35 webinars on topics just like this. So if this is of interest to you, please go to our website and check it out. We'd love to see you at any of our future programming. So I think just a few little housekeeping notes before we get started. Everyone, when they came on, should have been on mute. Just try to keep yourself muted if you're not speaking to avoid any background noise for our speakers. If you have questions, they are highly encouraged. There is a chat box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat, and then I will help moderate those either in the middle of the program or at the end. But we absolutely encourage interaction. Would love to hear the things that are on your mind and that you'd love to ask the experts, right? This is your time. So use it however you'd like to. So before we get started, I would like to ask David Barone if you'd like to share a few minutes with us about BMT Advisors. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and I'll pull slides up and we'll go from there. Okay, David, take it away.
Just a second, I need to increase. Okay, thank you, Rachel. Thanks for MassMedic for hosting this event. I'm a principal of Boston Medic Advisors. I'm glad to just spend a few seconds tell you about what is that we do, for those that are not familiar with us, and then introduce our speaker today. So, Rachel, can you move it to the next one? So we were founded in Boston about 15, 16 years ago. We have also an office in Germany that is led by Dr. Michael Imhoff, who would be the speaker today. We also have an office in Israel. We've worked with over 300 companies. Please move. Our activities cover all areas in healthcare. This is just a partial list of all the spaces that we have worked on. Please. Rachel. Our activities are diverse. They include strategies, they include also tactical issues. We work on strategies, we work on regulatory issues. We help companies design and execute clinical studies. We help them understand the markets, work on reimbursement issues, and help them on business development issues. So that's what we do. Can you move to the next one? So rather than spend a lot of time about us, I do want to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Michael Imhoff. Just tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll go to the presentation. So Michael is both an MD and PhD. Both degrees were received in Germany. He's board certified in surgery and intensive care medicine. He has spent the last 20 years in strategic consulting, the last 15 years or the last 10 years working with us as he gradually transitioned from clinical care to consulting. His research areas historically and more recently include trauma surgery, intensive care medicine, patient monitoring, clinical data management, artificial intelligence in medicine, and health economics. And it is really a partial list. He's a prolific writer with over 300 publications. He's a professor in medical informatics and statistics in Bochum, Germany. He's a board member of the German Associations of Biomedical Engineering, chairman of the section of patient monitoring, and he's on a number of editorial boards. So among all of those activities, I'm glad that you also had time to spend an hour with us this morning. So Michael, all yours.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for having me here this morning. And I would like to share my screen. And I hope it works. Yes, it works. And well, David is right that I'm a prolific writer, but the last couple of years, my prolific writing was kind of focused on clinical evaluations and then similar things connected to European medical device conformity assessment. And I would like to spend the next 30 minutes or so to talk about a few highlights or challenges with the ongoing transition to the European medical device regulation. There are, especially from a clinical perspective, there are challenges in the device risk classes, as you know them from the FDA, but we have seen a couple of upclassifications that have significant impact on how products are brought to market. There is a strong emphasis on the clinical evaluation of all medical devices, which is kind of, I would say, especially for the lower risk devices, a kind of stronger emphasis than you see it in America. There are very strict rules for equivalence, which affect also how we can conduct clinical evaluations, and that finally leads to more clinical data being needed. And the question is how to generate that clinical data. And I will finish off with two non-clinical challenges which may, for many of you, may kind of still hover under your radar screen, but which may also be kind of significant. But I would like to start with a brief overview of the European way of placing medical devices on the market. Well, as in the United States, you have one stop shopping with the FDA. In Europe, we are doing it a little bit more complicated. We involve several players. It's the European Commission to start with, which proposes the medical device regulation, and after it has been voted in Parliament and approved by the European Council, they implement the medical device regulation and also publish an increasing number of guidance documents. They are also, the European Commission is also in charge of the accreditation and the control of the notified bodies. The notified bodies, the second player, is a government, or notified bodies are government accredited, mostly private companies, where you have to pay also for them, that take over sovereign tasks on behalf of national authorities. So in the scope of the medical device regulation, they are responsible for the certification of the quality management systems of the manufacturers, and for the assessment of conformity of the medical devices, conformity with the medical device regulation. This includes, for instance, clinical evaluations, risk management, etc. The third player, which is not so visible, at least for most who are talking about the MDR, are the competent authorities. The competent authorities are the national authorities in each European country, which are typically reporting to the Ministry of Health in the respective countries. And they are responsible for device vigilance, for the approval of pre-market clinical investigations, and in case of uncertainty, for the final classification decisions for medical devices. Of course, they have many other obligations and tasks. And of course, the fourth player are the manufacturers, and I want to talk about the medical device regulation from the perspective of a manufacturer and what you're facing. The conformity assessment. In the conformity assessment, the manufacturer must prove compliance with the general safety and performance requirements of the medical device regulation. So you must show that your device is safe, effective, and bears some benefit for the patient. The conformity assessment means the process where you're demonstrating whether these requirements of the medical device regulation relating to the device that you want to bring into market have been fulfilled. Now, the notified body is not involved in the conformity assessment for medical devices that fall into class 1. But for all other classes, including class 1 with asterisks, we will talk about the asterisks later, a notified body must be involved in the conformity assessment leading towards the CE mark. And here we have also a big difference to the US way of placing products in market is the CE mark has to be renewed on a regular basis. That means after 1 to 5 years, you have to redo the conformity assessment. And this, you don't need to take any details from that picture, but this diagram shows you that there are not only a couple of players, but there are also many different ways how to get through the conformity assessment depending on the class of device, on the type of device, on the type of certification of the manufacturer and other aspects. And I don't want to go into any details with that. But as you already saw, the device classification is a very important aspect. It determines what requirements you have to fulfill in the conformity assessment. With the FDA, you have 3 classes. Class 1, general controls. Class 2, typically 510K. Class 3, typically PMA. Well, again, we are doing it a little bit more complicated. We have 3 classes. Where do I have an echo? Okay, we have class 1 that is also general controls only, but then we have this class 1 asterisk, which is class 1 devices that have measurement functionality, that are sterile, or that are reusable, so typically reusable surgical instruments. They are actually closer to class 2A than to class 1 within the MDR. Then we have class 2A and class 2B, which are pretty much comparable to what you see in class 2. In the US. Now, class 2B high risk, which means class 2B implants, class 2B devices that have drug delivery function. These are closer to class 3 than to class 2. And then we have, of course, class 3, including joint replacements, active implants like pacemakers. They get, well, the maximum of conformity assessment. Now, we already had these classes, basically, class 1, class 1A, class 2A, 2B, and class 3 under the old medical device directive, which many of you may know. But with the MDR, with the medical device regulation, we have now more implants in class 3 than before. We have new rules for materials of human origin, which places many more devices into class 3. Nanomaterials have been introduced into the MDR, and depending on the exposure of the patient to the nanomaterials, it may be class 2A, class 2B, or even class 3. Or devices intended for absorption by the human body. These are mostly class 3 devices. Combination products, so a combination of a fixed combination of a device and a drug, is typically class 3 now. New technologies like treatment of cells or tissues in vitro before subsequent infusion or implantation, for instance, in stem cell transplantation, these are now mostly class 3 or a combination of multiple devices ranging from class 2A all the way through class 3. And now in the ages of digital health, it's interesting to see the classification of software. Standalone software is always an active medical device of class 2A minimum, but depending on the actual risk, it may be class 2B or even class 3. So you may be up with a medical software, you may end up in a clinical pivotal trial. And that brings us already to the aspect of everything that has the word clinical in it. And the term clinical evaluation, I told you that clinical is more and more important with the MDR. And you see that, let alone with the how often the term clinical evaluation is mentioned in the medical device regulations, 132 times. Compare that to the old medical device directive. The latest version from 2007 has 7 times the term clinical evaluation, and the original version from 1993 only once. So you see that it seems that the European Commission with the MDR is serious about clinical data. So what is a clinical evaluation? A clinical evaluation is basically the evaluation of the assessment of the medical device to show that it is safe, effective, and has benefit and an acceptable benefit-risk ratio on the basis of clinical data. So the clinical evaluation shall be conducted throughout the life cycle of a medical device as an ongoing process. So it starts with the development and it ends with the end of service of the device. The clinical investigation, of course, and that has always been the case, is mandatory for initial CE mark, and it must be actively updated thereafter. When you're in, and now there is an explicit requirement to start with the clinical evaluation during the development of a medical device, and it makes a lot of sense to do that. And we did that also already under MDD for many devices, because with the clinical evaluation, you're defining the needs regarding clinical safety and performance and what clinical data you need to show that. And you identify equivalent devices and their clinical data, and then you're doing a gap analysis. So what data do we have? What data do we need? And that may lead to the conclusion that we need new clinical data from a clinical investigation. And I can remember a project where when we said, okay, we need a clinical investigation, we knew how expensive that would be, and then that would ruin the business case, and the project was stopped for the simple reason that we knew that we needed a clinical investigation. The clinical evaluation for the initial CE marking should provide sufficient evidence to show conformity to the general safety and performance requirements. And this is also an increasing emphasis with the medical device regulation, it shall identify the needs for future post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up. I mentioned the benefit risk analysis already. There is a strong emphasis on benefit. You should show benefit from the medical device, and you should assess it in conjunction with the risk. Please remember that benefit does not equal performance. Performance is a prerequisite for benefit, but the term, the benefit shall be shown for effectively for every medical device with few exceptions. And that seems also to be a difference to especially the 510K process with the FDA. In the process, you should assess the patient benefit from the device. You may need to quantify it. Then you're assessing the clinical risks from the device, and then you come to an assessment of the acceptability of the benefit risk profile. You will see that these are also tasks that are done in risk management. So there is some overlap between what you're doing in the clinical evaluation and in risk management, and there must be a very close coordination between the respective teams. If, for instance, medical alternatives change over time so that the benefit has to be viewed differently, that may impact the benefit risk analysis, and the results may change over time, and this may have an impact on the final conclusions of the clinical evaluation. And that is important because you have to update the clinical evaluation on a regular basis. Of course, whenever there are new relevant data from post-market surveillance. At least annually, it should be updated if the device carries a significant risk or is not yet established, so a breakthrough technology, for instance. It should be done every 2 to 5 years if the device is not expected to carry significant risk and is well established, of course, with everything in your clinical evaluation, you need to provide a justification for what you're doing. Well, effectively, this translates into at least annual updates of the clinical evaluation for Class 3 devices, the same for Class 2B implants and drug administration devices, for other Class 2B devices every 2 years, for Class 2A every 2 to 5 years, depending on the type of device, and for Class 1 every 5 years. And as I mentioned before, if there is new evidence that shows that, for instance, the benefit of the current device is less evident in comparison to new technologies or better alternatives, it may even in theory be taken off the market, or rather you may not be able to renew the certificate. So there is some constant pressure on manufacturers to repeatedly, again and again, show that the devices are not only safe and effective, but that they also provide adequate benefit. Equivalence has been a hot topic in the discussions about the MDR from the very beginning. Equivalence is often used to be able to take data from other devices that have been already on the market for some time and use them as evidence for the safety, performance, and benefit of your own device. Well, that has been widely used, and one may even say has been widely abused to some extent. And therefore, the European Commission has turned 180 degrees around. Now we have probably the strictest requirements on equivalence. All relevant aspects of device of equivalence must be shown in one medical device. Partial equivalence, as we know it from the 510K process, for instance, where we are trying to have two predicates, one for most of the features of the new device, and maybe one for any new application or functionality. Something like that is not acceptable under the MDR. And of course, only CE marked devices can be used as equivalent devices. You need to provide a detailed comparison, even on the level of development and production details, to show equivalence. That means clinical, technical, biological properties. But there is a recent guidance document on equivalence from the European Commission. And this is a quote from that guidance document. For all modifications and concomitant claims of equivalence, there must be no additional risks or potential of negatively altered performance related to the introduced modifications. This translates into, if there are technical differences, but the function is the same, equivalence may be claimed. So if you, for instance, have two different ventilators, intensive care ventilators, a hot topic in Corona times, of course. If you have two different ventilators, one has a turbine-driven gas generation and the other is valve-controlled, they are technically distinctly different, but they can provide the identical performance towards the patient. And in that case, which is something that you can test in the lab, in that case, the function is the same, and you may even claim equivalence for two different devices. But for higher risk devices, so for implants and Class 3, this is not acceptable. De facto, you can only use products from your own production, because for implants and for Class 3, you need to have full, unlimited, unrestricted access to the technical documentation of the equivalent device without time limitation. And if that is a different manufacturer, you need to have a contract on that. And I'm pretty sure that most vendors would refrain from signing such contracts. So with the clinical evaluation, what are the ongoing challenges? The clinical evaluation has to be conducted across the entire product, along the entire product life cycle. There's a strong emphasis on clinical benefit for all medical devices. There are very strict requirements for equivalence. We will need more data and more clinical studies. There's a strong emphasis on post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up, which is also the requirements are also fed from the clinical evaluation report, and more frequent updates are needed. I said we need more clinical data. Well, this clinical data can come from clinical investigations with the device or equivalent devices or other clinical studies. Mostly it comes from, at least for most devices, it comes from the scientific literature. For performance, safety, and benefit, it should be high quality journals. Studies with a product or with equivalent products, but also studies with similar products that are not equivalent, but they are doing about the same to establish the state of the art of a certain application. As I said, the scientific literature is still the preferred route for most devices and is still doable for most devices. And of course, you need clinical data from post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up. Now, when do you need clinical investigations? And here I would just want to quote the guidance document on clinical evaluations. It says, if gaps are present that cannot be addressed by other means, clinical investigation should be planned and carried out. So far, so good. Implants and high-risk devices, that's what we expected. Those based on technologies where there's little or no experience, also something not unexpected. And those that extend the intended purpose of an existing technology, that means you're extending, for instance, the intended use, or you have a new intended use for a legacy product, are most likely to require clinical investigation data. Clinical investigations, and now please buckle up, may also be required for other devices, including for devices in Class 1 and Class 2A, and for Class 2B devices that are not implantable. Well, the challenge increases because the gaps, of course, become wider due to increased requirements for equivalence. There are less devices that you can draw equivalent, that you can claim equivalent, and where you can draw clinical data from. And it's further aggravated to the change in the classification rules in the MDR that we discussed just a few minutes ago. If you need to do clinical trials, of course, it's a prospective clinical study that shall provide evidence for the performance and safety of a typically not yet approved or certified medical device, or if you're expanding the intended use of an already approved medical device. Such studies require the approval from at least one competent authority in Europe. And this is not required. They exempt studies within the intended use are exempt from that approval, of course, as we see it also in America. And the clinical trial, of course, can only be done or can only be submitted. The plan for a clinical trial can only be submitted after you have exhaustive preclinical studies and a complete risk management, quality management, etc. So you need to do everything to minimize the risk of the exposed patients in the study. There are strict requirements for study design and statistical planning, and I think that we have a pretty complex submission and approval procedure under the MDR. I would even say it's more complicated than before, but we have to see over time how that really works out. Another aspect or another way to get clinical data are post-market clinical follow-up studies, PMCF studies. And there are different ways or different potential designs like registry studies, retrospective analyses, even user surveys, which may overlap with proactive post-market surveillance. But you can also end up, depending on the type of open questions you have in the clinical evaluation, with observational studies or even with a prospective comparative study, also for already approved Class 3 products, so for products that are already in the market. Challenges are, for established products, we often have clinical data, or only we have only clinical data that may not be sufficient to show performance and safety as required by the MDR. I can even remember a case of an implant that was 10 years ago approved by the notified body without any clinical data of its own. And now they say the same notified body for the same device, which has a pretty good safety record, says, okay, even the randomized controlled trial that was sufficient for the FDA is no longer sufficient under MDR. So you can encounter a few surprises. So bottom line is, what was sufficient before may not be enough today. So the ongoing challenges with clinical data are that we are requiring clinical data for all medical devices, including low-risk devices. Of course, we need to do extensive literature searches and analyses. Thus far, sufficient clinical data may not be enough under the MDR. Not using clinical data is possible, and there are also some device groups, it's not many, some device groups exempt from clinical data or from showing showing the compliance with the GSPRs with clinical data, but these are only a few. For any else, again, you need a detailed rationale. As I said, you need to justify everything. PMCF studies, proactive PMS, we already mentioned. Clinical trials may actually be necessary, more even for existing products, and we will see more clinical trials for medical devices. But if you need to do a clinical trial, if you need to do a clinical study, please don't be afraid of sponsor-initiated studies. You being the sponsor give you the full control over the trial, which you may not have with an investigator-initiated trial. And of course, sponsor-initiated trials are required for certain questions like the pivotal trial or expansion or extending the intended use. In any case, if you're doing clinical, or if you're planning for clinical studies, and if you ever wanted to also go to the US market, or if you're in the US market and want to go to Europe, please coordinate your European and your FDA activities with respect to studies. You can often do the same study or a slightly modified study for both legislations and save a lot of money by just talking to both parties at the same time. I just want to finish off with two non-clinical highlights. The first one is the authorized representative. Well, the authorized representative is a well-known concept. It's not new, basically. It's a person that you're a legal entity that you need in Europe to represent you if you are a manufacturer from outside Europe. And it's the same with the FDA, vice versa. And the definition in the medical device regulation is that an authorized representative is any natural or legal person established within the European Union who has received and accepted a written mandate from a manufacturer located outside the Union to act on the manufacturer's behalf in relation to specific tasks with regard to the letter's obligation under this regulation, namely the medical device regulation. Well, important are the major changes between MDD, Medical Device Directive, and Medical Device Regulation with respect to the authorized representative. First of all, the manufacturer of a medical device cannot transfer to the authorized representative his responsibilities for the devices or the fulfillment of the requirements according to the respective regulations. So the authorized representative cannot take over any tasks in the conformity assessment. And the requirements on the authorized representative are much higher under the new regulation. For instance, the authorized representative must have complete access to the tech file of the device. Actually, they must keep a copy of the entire technical documentation in their organization. They also must report any major violation that they see on the side of the manufacturer to their competent authority. So, and they take significant liability even in case of bankruptcy of the manufacturer. The second, and that's then the last highlight, is the person responsible for regulatory compliance. This is a new position, that's a new role. As a manufacturer, it's the person who should make sure that conformity of the devices is appropriately checked, that the technical documentation, the declaration of conformity are okay, that the post-market surveillance system is implemented and kept up to date, and that all vigilance obligations are fulfilled. You also need a PRRC at the authorized representative. Here, this person ensures that the tasks of an authorized representative, as specified in the mandate are fulfilled. So for each manufacturer, there must be at least one PRRC, which has to be an employee of the manufacturer's organization. For manufacturers outside the European Union, the PRRC must also be located outside the European Union. Outsourcing, that's also, I think that's something important. Outsourcing the responsibility of the PRRC to a third party is only acceptable for micro or small manufacturers. And in the European definition would be less than 50 employees and less than 10 million euros annual revenue. And finally, the authorized representatives must also have at least one PRRC, which they can outsource. But the PRRC of the manufacturer and the PRRC of the authorized representative must not be the same person, and the PRRC of the authorized representative must be located in the European Union. So let me conclude. As you may have seen, the new medical device regulation, and I only highlight very few aspects, the new medical device regulation poses formidable challenges for all stakeholders. There is a significant emphasis on clinical data to show performance, safety, and benefit of the device. With the new stricter rules of the medical device regulation, more clinical data and more clinical investigations will be needed. This is also due to the fact that we have an up-classification of several device groups and strict requirements for showing equivalence. And actually, the lower the risk class, the higher the incremental effort under MDR compared to the MDD. For instance, for class 3, it's not, there are a lot of changes, but by and large, you already had the same competencies. You were used to doing clinical trials and to do very frequent updates of the clinical evaluation. But for a simple instrument maker who has now moved from class 1 to class 1R means that suddenly it's no longer general controls, but that a notified body is involved and that they have a completely different documentation, a much more elaborate quality management system, etc. And many of those small, often small companies, instrument manufacturers are just going out of business for that reason. And keep in mind, the conformity assessment actually begins with the start of development, and at some point in time, you may want some help. Thank you very much.
That was awesome. Thank you so much. I love the ending with "you might want some help," because I think that is really crucial. We definitely have some questions coming in, so we'll spend the next few minutes, if that's okay with you, Dr. Imhoff, asking some questions from the audience. So the first one, and I'll try to clarify this, but if I'm missing anything, please let me know. So someone's asking a question about listing the authorized representative along with the CE number within IFU and labels. And if there's a change from that, whether they still need to have the manufacturer and the authorized representative on both labels and IFUs moving forward.
Honestly, I cannot answer that question because that's not a clinical question. I would suggest to ask the notified body about that.
Okay, so that's a notified body question. Understood. Okay, and when it refers to clinical evaluation, how is risk and benefit assessment conducted for AI ML based softwares and medical device?
The clinical benefit depends And also the clinical risks depend on the intended use and the indications for use. And so if you, for instance, say you have a drug calculator, which would be a medical device software, would be could be a standalone software, then you need to show that, of course, it works without problems. The risk, you can easily assess what happens if you calculate the wrong dose. By the way, that would also determine whether you are in class 2A, class 2B, or class 3. For instance, when you're a drug calculator for chemotherapeutics, then of course you may end up in class 3 because a false dose calculation can effectively kill the patient. And the benefit would be, for instance, the reduction of medication errors. If you claim that, if that would be a claim, you need to show clinical data for that reduction of medication errors, which may end up with, in a clinical trial.
Mm. Okay, so can physician feedback from social media sources, LinkedIn, Twitter, be used as alternative data sources if that information can be verified by a follow-up survey from the physicians as received by the manufacturer?
I think the follow-up survey could qualify as clinical data. Social media, probably not.
Okay.
Yeah, so then
Could
the social media would be the recruitment mechanism for the survey. I think that would be perfectly okay.
Okay. Can you talk about what happens when a medical device OEM wants to use a contract manufacturer to produce the device?
Yes, well, again, that's not a clinical question, but that's a question that we frequently discuss. That is another aspect of the MDR. You have to fully certify and quality control your supply chain. That means if you outsource manufacturing, you have to put on the same scrutiny on your manufacturer as you would put it on your in-house manufacturing. That's the bottom line. It's still, there are many details to that, but there must be you must really be in full charge of the quality control of your manufacturer and or of your suppliers in general, and that's, especially for smaller companies, a extremely challenging task.
Absolutely. Any thoughts on how they might do that? I mean, obviously that's really difficult if you are in a different part of the world, to try to understand and really get a good handle on the quality of your suppliers and vetting them. Any initial kind of tips on that?
Well, especially in Corona times, it's kind of very challenging. But I think depending on the type of product, at least the full documentation of the quality management system and similar things. But I think you will, at the end, need to visit the manufacturer and do your own audit.
Yeah, that's true. That's tough right now, but I completely agree with you. I think that's important. Just a follow-up question to that one. Do both parties need to be identified on the label? So the manufacturer and the device OEM, how does the label work?
No, the labeling is on the labeling. You see only the company who brings the product to market, who is the legal manufacturer. So if you have an OEM product and put on your own label, you become the legal manufacturer. And that's what's on the label.
So
It's a
another
different
question
thing with
around
tradeware. Of course, with tradeware, it's a different thing. Then the label is not changed.
Okay. Another question around labeling. Are manufacturers allowed to use electronic labeling versus providing paper labeling instruction for use in product packaging? And is the review process different for electronic labeling?
Honestly, I have no idea, but my understanding is that you have some kind of physical labeling.
Okay, so your understanding is some kind of physical. Are guidance documents available for determining device equivalence for CER purposes?
Yes, it's the latest document is the MDCG 2020-5.
2020-5. Great. Okay, next question. Is proactive post-market surveillance considered to be PMCF, or are they separate and distinct?
No, PMCF is a subsection or part of PMS, post-market surveillance. So what I said, active post-market surveillance, so going out to the customer, asking whether the product is okay, whether it fulfills their expectations, whether they see any problems, blah, blah, blah. That is proactive post-market surveillance, but also may overlap with post-market clinical follow-up when you're doing a survey study. So, but post-market clinical follow-up is considered part of post-market surveillance, and for both you need a plan.
Okay, so it sounds like a lot of this comes down to planning and really getting all of your ducks in a row before you get started.
Yes. And interesting enough, and that's why I put so much emphasis on clinical, not only because I'm a clinician and I'm doing mostly clinical stuff within the conformity assessment, but we have seen a dramatic increase over the last few years in the sheer volume of documentation when it comes to clinical aspects. And there are products where clinical is 20-25% of the tech file.
Interesting. Okay, so in your experience, are most non-EU based manufacturers using a single importer under the MDR versus multiple distributors? No clue.
I don't know. What you need is what I did not talk about importers. I did talk about authorized representatives. Not every importer is an authorized representative.
Interesting. Very complicated. So if there are any more questions from the audience, everyone please chime in. But I know I have some questions just around the delay, right? So everything's kind of been thrown up in the air with COVID and the delay on implementation. What are your overall thoughts on what people should be expecting? Is anything going to change? What should we be planning for?
No, and the delay is a delay. It's not a change. So nothing, as far as we see it, nothing has changed. And and actually most companies or many companies were under extreme pressure to meet the deadlines, May 25th this year. And now we have eased that pressure a little bit, but the pressure is still on. It's only a few, it's not, it's 10 months still to go, and 10 months are not much for what you're up to.
Any chance, I mean, this is just a random question. Clinical data must be incredibly hard to come by during COVID, right? And if all of this evaluation and data is needed, I mean, any chance that's going to be a major problem for folks?
It has already been a major problem before COVID. And if we, I would assume, and that's just my personal opinion, that there is no word about that in Brussels or anywhere else. If we see a major second wave with COVID, I would not be surprised if there were a further delay for that simple reason. But especially in Europe, if the situation is as stable as it is now, I would assume that there will no further postponement of that deadline.
Great question just came in from the audience. I was going to ask this one too. Does the delay give manufacturers the opportunity to get devices cleared under the MDD instead of the MDR?
Yes.
And my understanding of that is if you are cleared under MDD, you have a certain amount of time before you have to bring up to MDR standards. Is that correct?
That's correct. That depends on the duration of the certificate. As I said, for class 3,
Okay.
it's only 1 year. For class 1, it may be up to 4 years, not 5 years,
Okay.
because if you're recertifying and just the last day, you will not get the full 5 years, but you will only get 4 years. But
Mm.
keep in mind that every change that requires a new conformity assessment to the device means that you have to go through the MDR conformity assessment with that device. And that effectively means that with that MDD CE mark, your device is frozen.
Mm.
Yeah, and that is something that you need to keep in mind. And especially if you have more than one product and a couple of products need to go through MDR, that's where you already know for sure that you have to go through the MDR. And you're in the process of updating your entire documentation to MDR, which is also a challenge. Then, of course, you should not go. There may be reasons where you go for MDD. For instance, if you know that you will phase out the product in a few years, then it may be worthwhile to still go for MDD. But in most cases, it may be worthwhile to, even if you have now gained 1 year, to go through the MDR.
Interesting.
But that's an individual decision that you need to take, and that is also something. It has also something to do with the available capacities of the notified bodies. This is actually currently the major bottleneck.
And just high spitballing here, your opinion is that because it's the EU Commission, they're going to go based on how things are going with COVID in the EU versus not necessarily taking into consideration how things are going outside EU.
Yes. That's my
Interesting.
understanding. And also the FDA would not take any consideration about Europe or China.
Yep, absolutely. Before we finish up, what are kind of the top questions you're getting as folks come to you to say, hey, I need some help with this? What are kind of the heavy hitters that are coming to you?
Well, for me as the clinical director, also not only as a senior consultant for senior advisor for Boston Medical Advisors, but also as the medical director of the QTech group here in Germany, where we are doing all of the tech file and including clinical evaluations. And we are mostly faced with questions, what clinical data do we need? Is the latest CR still okay? What do we need to do with the clinical data migrating from the MDD to the MDR and similar things? And of course, it has also to do with quality management, with risk management. So it's there are a lot of different functionalities and roles involved in that. But my impression is that still the question of clinical data is still one of the hot topics, and for most of our clients.
Interesting. Okay, I do have one more question and then we'll let you go because I know we're coming right up on time. But so there's been a lot of talk in the US, right? So FDA granted the emergency use authorization. Products can now have an easier pathway to market. What are the options for EU in that scenario? Are there similar things?
Honestly, in the MDR, they are talking about things like that. There is also in one guidance document, there is talk about devices for unmet medical needs. But effectively, I do not see any real established process for this like we have it with the FDA. There, in this respect, the FDA is definitely much better than what we have in Europe.
So they're talking about it, but no one's really put out the guidance
No.
this is how you do it, and these are the ones that have succeeded, right?
Yeah,
it's okay. So FDA's really jumped on that one. Okay, well, unless we have any other questions from the audience, we're right up on time. I know I learned a ton from this. Dr. Impop, this was fantastic.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
so much. Thank you to Boston MedTech Advisors for helping us pull this together and for making the connection. I think this was just a fantastic session. We will be sending out slides and we'll send out a video within the next 24 hours. So if you'd like to share it with colleagues, please do. We highly recommend that if you have questions, please reach out to Boston MedTech Advisors right there. They're here to answer any questions, and don't hesitate to reach out to MassMedic. My email is rachel@massmedic.com. You can always ask us questions as well. So on that note, I will say have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you all again soon.